Here at the Canadian Club, we have always been a forum for public figures, thought leaders, and decision makers to share their ideas and inform the most relevant and compelling conversations of our time.
We are dedicated to encouraging debate on the issues that matter to this city, this province, and this country.
The Canadian Club is one of the most important podiums anywhere in the world that a Canadian can speak to, tell Canadians what it is that they think, develop those thoughts. And so I want to thank you for that very, very much.
Please join me in thanking our esteemed panelists today.
Through our programs and events, including our youth and young leaders programs, our diversity partnerships, our joint events, and our media and social media opportunities, we offer you access to dynamic political, social, and business figures from abroad and right here at home.
The platform from which the eloquence of Canada has flowed all of that time, whether it be business, education, politics, sports, arts, and culture. If someone wants to say something to Canadians about this country and about the future of this country, this is the venue you choose.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. That was almost Pavlovian, the reaction to the bell. That was really, really well done. Good afternoon. My name is Joseph Lowe, President of Canadian Club Toronto, and I'm delighted to play the role of your host today. Welcome to those of you who are joining us online. Thanks to the AV services of our partners, Van Valkenburg Communications and MediaEvents.ca. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank as well the Smith School of Business at Queen's University for their generous support and sponsorship of our event today. We're also deeply grateful to the support of Canadian Bankers Association for being our season sponsor throughout our 125th season. And finally, I'd like to thank Canada's Forest Trust, an ESG company planting smart forests to take action on climate change with the power of nature. I'm pleased to share that our partnership with the Trust is reducing the carbon footprint of our entire season of Canadian Club Toronto events. So what would you like to ask today's panelists? What issues do you wish that CEOs be more or maybe less outspoken about? Please use the Q&A cards that you'll find at your tables. We will come around and get them to Andy Willis, our moderator. And for those of you joining us online, hit the Submit a Question button, as always, on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll be able to get your questions that way as well. And now it's my pleasure to introduce to you your esteemed panel members. Tabatha Bull, President and CEO, Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business. Tabatha believes that addressing the economic marginalization of Indigenous people can have a positive impact on Canada's prosperity. She is Anishinaabe, a proud member of Nipissing First Nation. Awarded CEO of the Year for 2022 by the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, President and CEO, is committed to helping rebuild and strengthen the path towards reconciliation and a prosperous Indigenous economy to benefit all Canadians. Tabatha is dedicated to diversity and removing systemic barriers to improve opportunities for Indigenous business and women across all industry sectors. Dr. Wanda Costen, Dean, Smith School of Business at Queen's University. Wanda recently said, and I quote, a leader who is not socially engaged is not in tune with what's happening in society and, importantly, will not succeed. She is in her third year of a 5-year term as Dean of Smith School of Business at Queen's University. With previous experience in the U.S. military, the private sector, and academia, she brings a diverse background and skill set to Smith School of Business. She's ushering in a new, transformative, innovative, and inclusive approach to business education with the very ambitious goal of impacting global business education and so therefore, in turn, global business itself. Meghan Roach, President and CEO, Roots Corporation. Meghan believes that, and I quote, as a strong Canadian brand, Roots should represent and feel welcoming to all. She is making good on this belief with purposeful diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives across the storied company. Prior to joining Roots, Ms. Roach was a managing director at Searchlight Capital Partners, a private equity firm with operations in North America and Europe, and a member of the private equity investment team at the Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan. She began her career with KPMG. Jim Stanford, economist and director, Centre for Future Work. Jim thinks that the Bank of Canada has it wrong. We should be making more goods to fight inflation, and we should back off on chilling the economy. Jim is director of the Centre for Work and one of Canada's best-known economists. He served for over 20 years as economist and director of policy with Unifor, one of Canada's largest private sector trade unions. He's quoted frequently in the print as well as broadcast media. He is also the Harold Innis Industry Professor in Economics at McMaster University and an honorary professor in the Department of Political Economy at the University of Sydney. Moderating our discussion is Andy Willis, a business columnist for the Report on Business at the Globe and Mail. Andy has been a business communications and journalism professional for over 3 decades. Last spring, he published a book entitled Unprecedented, Canada's Top CEOs on Leadership During COVID-19. So Andy clearly knows a thing or two about leadership in a time of crisis. Now, before we get things started with the panel, it's my pleasure to turn things over to Dr. Wanda Costen, Dean of the Smith School, to frame some thoughts and talk a little bit about the university's research in this area. Wanda.
Good afternoon. Thanks for being here today. We're really happy to be partnering with the Canadian Club on this very important conversation. If you're here, you're likely a leader in business, or you lead a strategic business unit, or, as some of my students, you aspire to lead one of those units one day. In the past, if you had asked CEOs, leaders of businesses, what their challenges were, you'd likely hear things like increased costs, shrinking margins, a lot probably around the war for talent. Today, however, you're likely to hear commentary around Indigenous reconciliation, racial inequality and inequity, and perhaps as a result of the pandemic, the impact of supply chain, or perhaps how do we deal with hybrid and remote work? We were just talking about that at the table. But more importantly today, there's been a shift that's happened, which is this expectation that the public, society itself, has greater expectations for not only businesses, but for the leaders of those enterprises. And this is an experience that those of us who lead organizations had no expectation or thought would happen, certainly not as quickly. And because we at Smith are really focused on educating, preparing, and developing the future leaders of industry and government and nonprofits, we wanted to find out just how significant this shift was. So we reached out, we did a survey of business leaders, we did a survey of Canadians, and here's what we found from our respondents. Over 80% have this expectation that businesses will respond to societal issues, that they would do more in their roles, and that their businesses would do more to impact societal matters. More importantly, almost 90%, 89%, hold businesses equally accountable to charities for addressing societal issues. This is quite distinctly different from what we would have expected back in the days of my MBA, for sure, as we were more focused on Milton Friedman in the 70s, that all we had to care about was our shareholders and our stakeholders. It's bigger than that. And the reason why this is important is not only that these members of society are your clients and customers, but they're also your future employees and employers. So what could we do? What did we find out? It's clear that our own leaders are concerned about this. It's challenging. I was sharing earlier with Chancellor Emeritus Leach. I remember being a junior faculty member, and even before I came into academia, being able to speak publicly as a citizen, as an independent faculty member, but now as a dean, I actually represent Queens and Smith. And so what comes out of my mouth is taken to be the word and representation of the unit I happen to lead and the institution. This is also true for businesses today. What comes out of a CEO's mouth is not only taken to be their own personal stance, but as representative of their entire organization. That becomes important because of the people we surveyed, at least, that is reflective of the company, and that our customers and clients today are inclined to actually walk if those views do not align with their personal views on these societal issues. Think about that for a minute. What CEOs and business leaders say is taken to not only represent themselves, it is taken to represent their companies, and they're being held accountable for that. Here's what's even more shocking. Many businesses, many business leaders would choose then to stay in the background, to not say anything, to just be silent, neutral even. That's not an option. Because today, if you're quiet, they will also walk. They will hold you accountable for not having a voice, for not speaking out on these matters. And of course, we see this happening in my home country with Disney in Florida, and most recently, Bud Light. So what are we to do? We reached out, and I'm happy to be joined by my colleagues today to have a conversation and talk about the impact this is having on us as leaders, and to think about where we're going next. So I invite my colleagues to the stage, and I turn it over to you, Andy. Thank you. Comfy chairs. Oh, sure.
This is the bravest group of panelists I have ever encountered. I'm really looking forward to this session because I think, as most of you in this room know, there is no roadmap for where we are right now in terms of the role of corporate leaders in helping set an agenda, not only around business issues, but also around the big issues that face us as a society. And, you know, and as Wanda just indicated, this is a minefield. You look at what Anheuser-Busch is going through right now with the Bud Light boycotts, and Kid Rock taking a machine gun and shooting up cases of Bud Light. I mean, this is the sort of issue they don't teach you in any business school, including Queens, as good as that education is. So I want to sort of frame this for all of you and hopefully for the panelists. I want to help us understand what leadership looks like in an age like this. What is accepted behavior? What is expected behavior? You know, what is the framework that you need to make decisions as a business leader when you're dealing with these really thorny issues? When do you take a position? When do you hold back? And I think it's really, really valuable. And I also want to indicate, like, for all of us on this stage, for all of us in this room, this is new territory. As Wanda said, the framework for making decisions used to be, what does it mean to the bottom line? What does it mean for revenues and profits? Now the role of the CEO is so much different. And I find that, frankly, very, very exciting. I mean, it means a whole different set of soft skills are needed, a whole different path exists to leadership in companies and in organizations. And this is an incredible opportunity, but it is fraught. So I thought, you know, Meghan, you are a CEO at a large consumer company. These are issues you deal with every day. What I'd love is just we'll start with some really grassroots advice on just how you determine, how do you take the pulse of your company? How do you work with different stakeholders, employees, customers, and frankly, your board of directors to kind of find a view on some of these issues, and a view that frankly is authentic for you?
Yeah, well, I should start by saying one of my largest investors is also in the room, so we'll caveat it with that. You know, so I think at Roots we're lucky in that we have a really well-established value system. So our values are community, integrity, authenticity, and freedom. And so when we're having those conversations about what to do and what to say, we go back to those values, right? And so we speak to our employees, we survey our employees. I actually have a group of my employees here today who are all part of our Diversity, Equality, Equity, Inclusion Council, which I sit on, my head of legal sits on, my head of HR sits on, and other members of representation from across the company sit on. So that's part of it. We have these feedback loops. I think, the board of directors aspect of it, it really is going back to you've signed up to be part of a company that has these established values. And when you think about values like community, you think about values like freedom, that inherently means that you're gonna have to take positions on some of these issues, right? Because that's what we stand for, that's what we represent. And I think if you think about a company like Roots, which represents the Canadian landscape, and we've been here for 50 years this year, the Canadian landscape has changed. And I think we'd be, if we don't take positions and we don't represent ourselves in a more diverse, equitable and inclusive way, then we're also not speaking for how Canada is today. We're not changing with the Canadian economy. So that is part of what's really important to us and how we've thought about some of the integration across these things.
Tabatha, I'll just move down to you. So when you're interacting with companies, how do you help them sort of go through the process that Meghan just described? Go through the process of understanding that, look, it's not just about profit. You've got to have social obligations, including an obligation around reconciliation for something that is new for a lot of the CEOs you're talking to, I'm going to guess.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. And firstly, I hope the table of students is not discouraged by this whole conversation, because when Wanda was talking, I was like, I don't know anybody who wants to be a CEO at the moment. I think definitely it's a new conversation. And as leading a not-for-profit, where our mission is really about moving through reconciliation and solving the issues that were caused by the history of our country, it's a little different for us because it's a very clear mandate and mission about what we're talking about. And we see corporations across the country who are coming wanting to understand what is their role in reconciliation, what's their role in working with Indigenous communities and businesses. And we definitely see also, well, what's the benefit? Like, how does this help our bottom line? So there's definitely two different conversations that needed to be had at the same time about, corporations who are like, this is important, and we understand that this is important, and what can we do? And sometimes that's about, being vulnerable and asking the questions. So many organizations are afraid to ask the wrong question, and perhaps if they're going to offend somebody or offend a community. So we're really there to help them through that process. We have a certification process that really walks an organization through how they can build a reconciliation action plan. And then we have others that we're really talking about, this is why it's important. This is why it will help you to attract Indigenous employees. It will help you to better work with Indigenous people and businesses. And if you're looking at an infrastructure partner, the benefits of working with an Indigenous community who understands sustainability and understands the 7 grandfather teachings, understands that we think about 7 generations ahead. So in this world of ESG, sustainability, environment, an Indigenous business and community is really one of your best partners to have.
And are CEOs receptive to that? Do they understand that social license is now part of the way they have to do business?
Yeah, I think much so. And we're also seeing shareholders as well really pushing for CEOs to make those decisions. So in the last 2 years, there's been 6 shareholder proxies that have been put forward to organizations to both ensure that they're increasing Indigenous business in their supply chain, but also to build a reconciliation action plan. Yep. And many of those don't even have to go to shareholder vote. Like the management team agrees to that and moves forward. There has been one organization who the management team has disagreed with that and not put it forward. So we still have work to do. But on the main, we're really seeing. So TSX is a great example of that. It was voted 96% in favor by their shareholders, and it also took a conversation between me and John McKenzie to say, this is how we will help you through this process. And that definitely eased that concern about we don't even know where to start.
Yeah. And Jim, I'm going to guess that parts of what I'm saying, like this shift in attitude from all we care about is the bottom line to actually the rights of the workers are important, this has got to be music to your ears, because you and I have been talking for 3 decades, and the sort of social issues that you're highlighting in corporate governance that are now important, you've been highlighting your entire career. But do you want to just talk a little bit about how you see corporate thinking changing, and maybe even to be a bit provocative, like, are we into a bit of a fad right now? Are you at all concerned that there's going to be a pushback against social awareness, against some of the progressive issues? We're certainly seeing that in the States.
Yeah, you're right, Andy. It is music to my ears on one level. You know, I recognize the importance socially and culturally and politically of business leaders standing up and saying, yes, these are legitimate concerns and these things matter. On the other hand, I've got a little voice niggling in the back of my head saying, how far does this go? And, you know, I'm a trade unionist. I've been fighting my whole life for corporate social responsibility, but the kind where you actually sign a contract and pay higher wages to your workers as a result, as opposed to make a nice flowery advertising campaign about how much you believe in social license. So I do think that there's many challenges to this trend towards environmental and social governance in business leadership, which I welcome entirely. But one of them, I think, is to understand both the challenges in making it real and ultimately the limitations to it. You know, I don't agree with Milton Friedman very often, Andy. You've probably figured that out through my career. But in a way, he had a point about what the purpose of a corporation is in a competitive capitalist economy, which is the world that we live in, and the ultimate limitations on what a company can do that deviates from that. And while I welcome the efforts of corporate leaders to do something better in their own company through better practices or more transparency or more diversity in hiring and so on, I also, I think, appreciate that doing this one company at a time out of either the charity or perhaps the enlightened self-interest of corporate leaders is going to face limits. You could have a private equity firm come along at any point in time that doesn't, you know, really care about that public image as much, and if they think they can get more profit out of the business that you're doing, they've got ways to do it. We've seen that happen many times over. And this is where ultimate corporate social responsibility, in my judgment, will come from old-fashioned things like paying taxes, following the law, negotiating with your unions, as opposed to, you know, I would say some of the more symbolic things that we have seen so far.
And Wanda, maybe we can just build on this idea of a bit of a pushback, and, you know, where we want to end out versus and what are the dangers of not getting to that goal. Can you sort of just give us a framework based on your conversations with business leaders and academics on how to balance social impact versus profits?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I literally came back from Chicago just yesterday, where I was at the AACSB Dean's Conference. And this AACSB is the preeminent accrediting body for business schools across the world. 3 to 5% of business schools are accredited. And I was asked to facilitate a conversation around pushback on EDI, right? So this is real. And I have to be honest, it's a significant concern in business schools because, as I said, anyone who's heard me talk, we're providers of talent. So we have to provide talent that is prepared to deal with these kinds of issues, but we also have to provide talent from a wider array of backgrounds and experiences who can contribute in new and different ways. And so this is a very real piece. But I'm really struck by the focus on corporate social responsibility. We have a faculty colleague, Dr. Jacob Bauer, who does work on this and has for at least the last decade. And what we're seeing, to your point, is a shift in what CSR means. You know, if you think about 20 years ago, it really was about giving to charities, whether that was museums or something like that, giving back. Then we moved into what he calls 2.0, where it was real corporate social responsibility about, are we really following through, not greenwashing, but are we actually focused on these environmentalism? And now, of course, today, it's really broadened to the governance issues, to the authenticity, to the degree to which we actually doing what we say we're going to do, walking the talk, if you will. But what we're also learning is you actually get yourself into trouble as a business leader if you espouse certain values. So I appreciate Meghan's commentary, but if you espouse certain values but don't follow through on them, or if these are surface commentaries that have no real action, there's a huge backlash on that. I would argue there should be, right? Because it's about authenticity. So you're really talking about a very interesting time where there is backlash, much to your point, and it is around the fundamental responsibilities of a business and the degree to which business ought to be concerned with what's going on in society. Now, I happen to be on the other side of that, where I absolutely believe business has a responsibility to be engaged and to address the societal issues in the environments in which it operates. That might be slightly influenced by the fact that I'm a US citizen. because in the US we have a little bit less confidence, I should say, in our government to address these issues than we do in Canada. No, seriously, I mean, in the US, nothing happens if business doesn't act. If you look at all the legislation from the Civil Rights Act of 1964, 1991, the real changes happened because businesses decided that they needed to hire people from different backgrounds, that they needed to promote people into senior leadership. If that doesn't happen, we don't see the shifts that we have today. So that's a business responsibility, not a governmental responsibility. So those are my thoughts on that particular area.
That's terrific. I will add, just to build on what Wanda was talking about on walking the walk, you know, we're talking here about a lot of social activist campaigns, but just to give you a hint of what you're going to read tomorrow in your Globe and Mail, there was a company called Teck, a huge mining company out in Vancouver, that was attempting to spin out its coal assets, and they did it in a what one of my colleagues described as a greenwashing way. They created a new company, but all the cash still came back to Teck. What you're going to read tomorrow is, in the last couple of hours, Teck had to pull that idea. That the shareholders, not public pressure, but the shareholders voted down that concept. The idea that you can say that you're doing something good and then use tricky finance to actually not achieve anything is clearly not going to wash with investors. So again, not to put pressure on you, but what we're talking about here is really important. I've been asked to just really quickly, if you are online right now and want to send in questions, please do so. We would be glad to field them. And we do have some questions from the audience, so I'm going to come off script just a little bit. And Meghan, this one's coming your way because it's about private equity and the role that private equity plays as a shareholder. Can you discuss the impact of changes in ownership on companies and the proactive, and in particular, the impact that private equity has on the decisions of CEOs when it comes to the decisions on return on investment versus social good? And I'll ask others to comment on what different shareholders would mean to the way that you think about balancing off profits versus the larger corporate good.
Yeah, I mean, I think private equity sometimes gets a bad name for that, but I think the reality is that private equity does want to have the best interests of the company, the customers, and employees at heart, right? I mean, I think that I'm a public company. Ultimately, obviously, we want to generate profit too, right? But there's lots of ways to generate profit that are also benefits to society, right? And so I don't think that really, being or having a private equity backed, business or being a public company necessarily is the key driving factor of, whether or not you're balancing off the decision between, social good and profit. I do think that what you need to think about now is the fact that you have multiple different stakeholders, right? So I look at my stakeholders, I think about the fact that I have shareholders, I have customers, I have employees, right? And then ultimately, you have to think about the world in which you're operating and living, my suppliers upstream, all those types of things. So I don't think it's as simple as a trade-off of saying, today I'm going to make profit and tomorrow I'm going to invest in ESG. I mean, today, if you think about my employee base, it's been, and we were talking about this previously, we've attracted a lot more women, we've attracted a lot more people who are intersectional by just having people who are female in leadership, right? And that's great for me. I've got diversity of thought now, we've got different things that people are approaching and doing in a different way. And when I think about my customer base, having people internally who represent my customer base and having a diverse group of individuals who are represented in my campaign, all of those things are socially good, but at the same point, they're actually also aiding to my overall growth as a business, right? So I don't think it's as simple anymore as just saying this group does this and this group does this. I think that people are intelligent enough to realize that there's a commonality between these things that can benefit the whole if you think about them in the right way. Yeah, Wanda, please.
Interesting, and I apologize. This is one of my French colleagues who I'm sure I'm going to mispronounce his name as a U.S. citizen. Dr. Pierre Chagnol has actually explored some of this impact, and he's talking about the impact of ESG and holding your CEO accountable as part of their compensation to invest in ESG. And what he's talking about is this fact that in general, because we're looking at the performance of the organization and that the organization itself tends to be a bit more focused today on ESG, that's sufficient, that you don't necessarily have to add in ESG-specific criteria. However, he's also pointed out that if you choose to do that, it has to be a wide array. It can't just be one particular area, and that you really have to do a really nice job of identifying different metrics across the board, not just E, not just S, but also governance, and be more broad in that, and then follow up on it on a regular basis. You have to remain committed to this for like 5 years. It can't be, I'm going to jump on this bandwagon, as you're indicating, and then jump off. It's really got to be a consistent piece, and it's got to be woven into the organizational structure and the ultimate goals and objectives of the organization.
Jim, sorry, go ahead.
No. I was just going to say the core claim of many ESG advocates that it can be profitable to do good, okay, is I think where some of the challenges arise. Like clearly there are cases where you can make money by doing good things. You know, investing in renewable energy today is a no-brainer on that score. But there are clearly cases where the two do not coincide, and where paying fair wages to all of the workers in your whole supply chain is clearly going to have an impact on your profitability. So then where does the argument that we can do good and make money at the same time, you know, where does it come from, and how is it motivated? And sometimes it's a preemptive effort by business to prevent more meaningful or restrictive responses to those social problems from coming in. If we want to avoid unionization or higher taxes or tighter regulations on things, then we'd better look like we're socially responsible. And this again is another reason why I think we have to be very careful and scrutinizing the meaningful content of what some of these promises are, and making sure that we aren't seeing it as an alternative to what I would see as more genuine forms of regulation and accountability on the business sector.
Tabatha, I'm going to come to you, and this is out of the audience. The question is, to what degree does the public stance of a company live with the CEO? How does the company ensure continuity around these decisions, like buy-in around the decisions, right through the ranks, right through all the different stakeholders that Meghan mentioned a minute ago? And if you want to do this through the lens of reconciliation, that's great. But just how, you know, where does responsibility for social awareness and social activism live?
Yeah, so I think it definitely lives at the top. So both at the CEO executive team level, but also at the board as well. So if we're talking about from a perspective of reconciliation, or even some of the boards I have sat on from a perspective of culture change and equity and diversity, that needs to be on the board matrix and coming to the board as something that's being reported on at every board meeting. You know, oftentimes we see that if the board's not bought in, and the employees that are working on that aren't seeing where the value is in that work. And so I, prior to coming to CCAB, led Indigenous relations team at the electricity system operator here in Ontario. I had a very small team of 4 of us in an organization of 700. And leading that team, you know, if you're that small piece in the puzzle and you're just working every day, it's really like pushing a big stone up a hill. And if I had the leadership that was really asking, how is this impacting Indigenous business, and how is this impacting Indigenous community at the board level, then that's going to make your employees feel like the work that they're doing is really important across the organization. But I think also very important that it doesn't just live within HR or within your Indigenous relations team, that it's something across your whole organization. So our program, PAR, requires that you have a working group that's representative across your organization. So in your procurement team, in your marketing and comms team, and has executive level sponsorship. And that helps too, so that it's not just one CEO who's really committed to the organization, and when that CEO moves on, the values change, but that it really lives within the values, as Meghan said, and that the board has criteria to ensure that they're getting updates and they're reporting and checking in on the progress.
Yeah. Anybody want to add on to that one? And the overarching question there was, you know, where does the responsibility for public stances live with the CEO or elsewhere in the company? Anybody else want to build on that?
Maybe I'll jump on it.
Yeah.
I guess I think that, you know, ultimately, you mentioned this before, and we talked about this previously. I mean, I think ultimately the decision has to sit with the CEO, right? I think that, you know, you are the face of the company, and we talk about this a lot internally, which is that even if someone makes a decision, if someone goes on social media from my company and posts something that, you know, is negative, it still reflects on me as a CEO, right? It's still ultimately my responsibility to, you know, take responsibility for an action of my employee, right? So I do think it has to sit with the CEO, but I think to your point, I don't think it can only sit with the CEO, right? I think you have to think about the people you're bringing in, think about the policies you're putting internally, think about the teams you're building, and ensure that you're also helping to disseminate that culture of inclusivity, that culture of diversity, that focus on CSR and those types of things with the people you hire and the things that you're doing. So I think ultimately it is our responsibility, but I think that you can't do it by yourself. You have to build a team of people who are equally as passionate about it as you are, or else it won't really progress in the company, right? That's, I think, incredibly important.
And Meghan, go ahead, Wanda.
No, I was actually going to comment on that. I have an HR background, and it really comes down to allowing those values to permeate how you hire. It may mean you have to change the selection process. You may have to change the areas and the characteristics you're looking for on the CV itself, right? Oftentimes we are doing a really nice job of social reproduction. The only way we can really begin to affect change is to ensure that there are a wide array of people and voices represented around the table that makes decisions, and then ensure that as part of our selection process, we're infusing those values and commitments and behaviors into the entire organization. It can't just be around the senior leadership table.
Yep. Wanda, I'm going to stay with you for a minute. I just want to talk about the culture of a company, especially when the company is taking a position on issues, because even now on fact-based issues, there seems to be frequent times when we just can't agree. Groups within the company can't agree. I routinely disagree with things that Andrew Coyne writes in the Globe and Mail. Routinely. So how do you create a culture? What does a successful culture look like that can incorporate different views and then take a position on some of these difficult issues? So how do you get to that point? And I'll be interested in the other panelists who can sort of talk about how you square the circle with different, reflecting different points of view.
Yeah, I would argue this is the ultimate challenge of leadership, right? I've learned that I'm a very different dean than Dean Saunders. He was incredibly successful. We're grateful for all of his contributions to Smith, but I'm a different leader. We were talking at the table that it's really important to me to create community. That means engaging faculty and staff and students collectively, collaboratively on all the matters we're addressing. We're rolling out a new strategic action plan through which EDII and the sense of belonging and inclusion and collaboration are essential to how we move forward as a business school. That doesn't take away from the need to continue educating top talent. And that means that instead of just having a class or a course on ESG or EDI or indigeneity, we have to actually embed that into the entire curriculum. So similarly, I think what that requires is for us to create an environment where we want tension. Now this is I have to tell you guys, you're gonna throw me off the stage here. As a US citizen, this is my national bias, that Canadians are so nice that you're not willing to be contentious. And it's frustrating for a leader from the US, right? I need to hear—
Oh, Wanda, how can you say something?
Yeah. But we need that contention, right? At the end of the day—
Sorry, by the way.
See, yes, of course. Yes, of course. Thank you. Touché. But you understand what I'm saying, right? We actually have to have discussion and debate, sometimes passionately, to reach some consensus around who we are and what we're about and how we're going to move forward. And we must ensure that every decision we make aligns with that direction. And I will say this is a difficult one, but even for deans, we have to have the courage to step up and say, we're not going to do that. And sometimes that's going to upset people, but you have to stay the course. This is what, I mean, everybody wants to be a leader until you have to make these tough decisions, right? Being a leader is not easy. So it's up to us to be courageous and stand up with integrity and honor around what we say we believe. It's critical.
Fabulous. Anybody want to build on that point of just how to reconcile different points of view within an organization? Because we've got a couple of questions on that.
Yeah, maybe I think as a leader, it's very important that you show your vulnerability to your team. That, I don't know the answer. I don't know what we should be out there saying on every piece, because I have an individual experience in my life that my team has a very different experience, and their perspective needs to be included. And I think, this is particularly important as a not-for-profit with a team that is so incredibly committed to the work that we're doing, that it's really important for me to ensure that they believe in what I'm saying as well, and that I've taken their perspective into what I'm saying. Because I, don't just represent CCAB, but when I go out there, I represent my team, and my team needs to believe in what we do. So I think it's really important to, ensure that you're continuing that culture when you get to those decisions, that you're taking in those perspectives that we say so often. It's so important to have a diverse team because there's so many different perspectives, but then we need to ask for those. We can't just go out and bring our own. Of course, at the end, the decision does rest with us as to what we say and what we involve ourselves in from that perspective, but I think it's so important for us to be vulnerable and really ask for the input.
Tabatha, I'm going to stay with you for just a moment. I'm going to talk for a second, but we ran some stories in the Globe and Mail last year around the Black North Initiative. So the Globe and Mail signed the Black North Initiative, we committed to diversity, and then we decided as a newspaper, well, we're just going to monitor, we're going to check in with all these companies 12 months in, 24 months in, and we found two things. First of all, a lot of companies hadn't made any progress at all, and second of all, they really resented being held accountable. But can you talk, Tabatha, for just a minute about accountability around social awareness? And I think this comes back to what we were talking about a minute ago on greenwashing. This idea that you've got to be an authentic.
Yeah, thanks. I was really interested in that story as well. When the Black North Initiative was first launched, we had a couple conversations, and I asked the question, like, how are you going to measure? Like, it's great that these organizations are signing on to the Black North Initiative, but what do they have to do? Like, what is the actual tasks that have to be done, and how do you measure against that? And I know I've spoke about this really is not a commercial for our program, but our program is work, and we do have organizations that are like, I want to be certified in Indigenous relations, but that looks like a lot of work. And the answer is it is work. You can't just sign on and say, we support Black employees and without having any type of measurement. And it does mean that we have over 200 organizations in the program, but we have people who say, like, this is too many resources for our organization, and if that's the case, we say, okay, well, come back when you're, like, ready. There's other ways that you can still support Indigenous business without, like, going through this process. There's lots of ways to increase them into your supply chain and start learning and going on a learning journey. But it's not enough to just sign on. And I worked at lots of organizations also who come out with a gender diversity or sign a gender diversity declaration without any programming or any change happening. And so I think it is incredibly important that we both say what are the targets that we're going to try to achieve in this process and then measure against them and be public about those commitments.
Yeah. Jim, is there anything you want to add just on this idea that corporations, if they're going to make these commitments, need to be accountable? It seems common sense, but.
I was struck by the results from the Smith survey. One of them that I thought was quite powerful was the average response of how much companies should give back to solving social problems was pretty significant. 21% was the result on the survey, the average that companies should give of their after-tax profit to solving social problems. And I think on the one hand, this is a recognition in the people who did the survey and in the public at large that, first of all, there are social problems that have to be solved. Secondly, business has had a role in the creation of those social problems. Let's be honest, they didn't just happen. And third, business as social institutions have some responsibility to contribute meaningfully. 21% of your after-tax profit is a lot. Here's a fun fact. In Canada, the federal general corporate income tax rate until 2001 was 28%. Then it was cut by successive governments down to about 15%. And then we have provincial income taxes in Canada as well that were cut in many provinces. And interesting, if you were to go back to the previous rate of taxation on companies, that would be equivalent to about a 20% increase in after-tax profits to get back to where they were. So, I don't think it's actually irrelevant, those two comparisons. I think that if corporations are going to make a more meaningful contribution to inequality, poverty, exploitation, pollution, they are going to have to put significant resources into it. And I'm not advocating for the return of corporate taxes to the 1999 level. On the other hand, I'm not opposing it either, Andy. And I think it is an indication of the scale of the problem, where it does have to be meaningful. It can't be symbolic.
Another question from the audience, and Wanda, I'll send you your way, and then anybody else can jump in. But someone's asking, how do you resolve conflicting positions on ESG topics, and how do you also, sort of a two-part question, how do you, as a corporate leader, figure out if you should jump in on an issue that is publicly popular, but in many ways unrelated to your business. So where do you choose to put your in? Where do you choose to just stay in the background?
Ultimately, it has to align with your organization and what your mission and vision is for your organization. There's a new term out there today called #activism.
Oh.
Right, that's what you're talking about. Hashtag, it's not authentic. Everyone's jumping on the bandwagon. Everyone's posting some kind of hashtag on social media. That's not real. And so if you're really going to be an ally, for real, if you're really going to jump in and do this, it has to start at the top. It has to be woven through all the activities that you do in your organization. And I would argue it has to align more appropriately with the purpose of your organization. Why do you exist? I can tell you at Smith, we started our strategic action plan very differently. We actually started with our purpose. Why do we exist? It wasn't about the mission and the vision. Those are all beautiful words. But why are we here? What are we doing? And I think organizations have to start with that as well. Now, how do you figure it out? This is the hard part, right? But I would agree with my panelists that you have to create an environment that invites challenge respectfully, that we engage with each other with dignity and respect, but that we invite different opinions and views, and that we reach consensus. Now, I'll be honest, consensus takes a lot of time. It requires an immense amount of trust, right? It requires an immense amount of empathy. And some would argue, some organizations, we don't do that very well. So really, it's this whole notion of shifting how we operate as organizations, and then living up to that and ensuring that the activities and the decision-making process in general is different than it has been in the past. That's the only way you're going to get there collectively. And then recognize, as Abraham Lincoln said, you're never going to please all the people all the time. But again, that's the role of a CEO.
Everyone's making it sound so hard to be a CEO.
I know.
These days, balance all these things and confront
colossally underpaid, Jim. They're all colossally underpaid.
We should remind the students over here who might be second guessing their decisions that pay and benefits are still pretty appealing. Just.
I think I'm going to just jump in on that quickly. I think the other thing that's really important is to not take up space for the people who it's their story to tell. Mm-hmm. And when the Greys were confirmed a number of summers ago, we had a lot of questions, and a lot of media asks. And I was very clear to say, this is not our story. We're an Indigenous business association. And to your point, that is our purpose to be here. And it's not our place to take up space in media to talk about this and to somehow weave it into a conversation about business, because it's, for sure there's connection, but it's really about ensuring that the people who it's story to tell also continue to have that voice. So while there might be things that you're very passionate about in your organization and align with your organization's values, but as leaders, it's important for us to make sure that we leave space for those people to tell their own story.
I think that's a really, really important point. The other thing, Meghan, I'll come to you with this, and then again, back to the panel, but we've talked a little bit about how frightening this environment is, and I praised you all for being so brave to be here. But I also really believe that there's huge opportunities in this evolving leadership role. And I'll go to a specific. I think the Nike shoe brand did themselves a real favor. I buy their shoes because they signed up Colin Kaepernick after he was tossed out of the NFL for basically taking a civil rights stand. So can you, as a CEO, and sort of through a marketing lens, obviously don't comment directly on Nike unless you're comfortable doing so, but how do you kind of balance the danger to your brand versus the opportunity for being cutting edge and memorable, for being on top of these issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to really figure out that line between being performative and then, so if you are, I really disagree with, you shouldn't be marketing something that's related to diversity, equality, equity, inclusion because you want to acquire new customers, right? Yeah. That's not the right thing to do. I think that, if you, from our perspective, we established at the beginning of the year 4 pillars we focus on. We give a certain percentage of our sales year-long to charities, and then we might emphasize those charities at certain times during the year, but we're partnering with them over time, right? So I really think it has to go back to that purpose of why are you doing that campaign? Is that campaign just benefiting you and it's just acquiring new customers for you? Or is it actually an important thing that you're communicating out to a broader community base that you feel passionate about, your company aligns with? And then to your point, Tabatha, that it's your right to talk about, right? So in some cases you have to be very, very careful with that. And that line between being performative and, is it marketing or is it something else is really fine, right? And I think that's a lot of what we talk about as a business, is that where do you lean into something because you support that and it fits with your values and fits with the values of your company, versus saying something just for the sake of being out there and having your kind of hashtag out there too and saying, well, so this company did it, so we should do it too, right? Yeah. That's not the right approach to things, and it has to really start from a foundational level that you establish well in advance of something happening, so that when something does happen, you actually you have a base for that. It's not just, you're not just doing it because something's happened, and that I think is really important. And I think we've seen over the last 3 years especially, that with a number of different things being brought to the forefront, that many companies were caught out because they were reacting to something that happened, and then consumers and customers were saying, well, wait a second, you've never supported this issue before, and now all of a sudden it's important to you. How does that make sense? And are you just being performative, or is this something you actually care about?
Wanda, do you want to build on that at all, and the opportunity that comes with being identified as a social activist?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I will say it must be authentic, right? You can't just come to the party in the 11th hour. And I would just say, again, this is a conversation around who your employees are. And I think it also has to do with your brand, the service or product that you're producing, and what role does that play in whatever the issue is that you're advocating for. It makes sense for certain brands and products to align in certain ways. But I would say across the board, I certainly have an expectation that leaders will be shifting and changing their organizations, particularly as it relates to the demographic composition of their organization, and especially of the leadership of that organization. You cannot tell me that you are committed to equity, diversity, inclusion, accessibility, anti-racism, and belonging if your board and senior leaders look all one way, and it's the historical way they have looked. I'm sorry. Proof is in the pudding. And so our role is to be educating the future leaders so that they can manage those different types of folks and be successful. But it's also to challenge our corporate partners and our industry partners to say, you have a responsibility to hire talent that represents a wider array of perspectives and experiences. And as we've all been talking about, that enhances the quality of your organization. It's not easy, but it definitely enhances the quality of your organization.
Thank you, Wanda. I'm going to finish up. I've got one question, and I hope each of the panelists, I'm going to ask you to give a one-word answer to this phrase. The leader of tomorrow, Wanda, starting with you. Leader of tomorrow is one word.
Holy cow. I have the gift of gab. You really going to make me say one word?
One word only. Yeah.
Intentional.
Jim.
Compassionate.
Thoughtful.
Adaptable.
Authentic.
All right.
Thank you very much to this panel.
All five.
And thanks. Joseph, I can just say, thanks to all of you. I have done a lot of these panels. I praise the Canadian Club and Queens for creating a panel that I got more questions tonight than I've got in the last 10. Thank you.
Tabatha, Wanda, Meghan, Jim, thank you for such, I think authentic was one of the words that we had talked about quite a bit today. A really authentic and diverse discussion today. I think this is what the Canadian Club is about, is fostering divergent perspectives to really kind of emerge from when the doors open with kind of new thoughts in our minds, and maybe kind of a more pitter-patter in our footsteps as we emerge from the session. So thank you so much. And in fact, it's interesting, kind of as we were chatting, and I think Milton Friedman was referenced maybe 3 or 4 times from divergent speakers, and just not that he's speaking from the grave, nor to give him the final word, but there are a couple of things that he did say that were actually quite resonant with our discussion today. Quote number 1, of the greatest mistakes is to judge policies and programs by their intention rather than their outcomes. I think, Jim, you were actually speaking to that. Second, a society that puts equality before freedom will get neither. A society that puts freedom before equality will get an ample supply of both. So interesting thoughts from maybe our 5th panelist from today. And Andy, to you as always, thank you for your expert moderation of a really exciting and relevant topic today. Members and guests, before we close, let me tell you about a few of our upcoming in-person events. On Tuesday, May 2nd, the Honorable Roach, Premier of the Yukon, will be in conversation with the Honorable Lisa Raitt, Vice Chair Global Investment Banking at CIBC. That'll be back here at the Royal York. On Thursday, May 8th, we'll have a panel of tech experts exploring what's next for Canada's tech ecosystem. I invite all of you to visit us at canadianclub.org, whether it be online or here in person, to find out more about these events, look at membership options as well as ticket options. I'd also like to offer another round of thanks to our event sponsors today, the Smith School of Business at Queen's, for supporting the conversation and really giving us a platform. Members and guests, thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you again soon.